Welcome, class. We are back again. Hopefully you all had a relaxing spring break. We are going to start a new unit on poetry. Having justice behind us, we can still carry some of those ideas into how poets may use their form and pacing and all the elements we'll be looking at to express ideas of importance or personal emotions. As you see here, what is poetry? It's which intensity is given to the expression of feelings. Style and rhythm are very strong components, not just how you hear a poem, but also when you're reading it, how it looks on the page will have a very big effect on how that story affects its audience. This week, we'll be looking at several different elements that make up poetry or a poem. We will occasionally be joined by my kitty Paige, who you are seeing in the lower right-hand corner here. For this PowerPoint, I will encourage you to take notes. There will be a understanding check quiz on our class page this week, which you're expected to complete by Friday. And so there will be several things I'll have you do, but you are welcome to move at your own pace. But for our lesson this week, we'll be going through different elements of poems, and you're welcome journal or notes-wise to just write notes down on paper, or to use an electronic means such as Word, or if you use an iPad, you write on there. Whichever way helps you, because note-taking is a skill that we also want to keep practicing at as well, since it'll be indispensable towards success in the future. So let's continue forward. We're going to first start off with poetic forms, with the sonnet, which was mostly made famous by Shakespeare. A sonnet is simply a rhyming poem with 14 lines. Now, a line is simply when a phrase continues on to the space underneath it. So regardless if the sentence is over, it starts a new line. So if you look at examples right here, and this one, and then this one, as you can see, sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, comma, sentence is not over. So once it goes down to here, it becomes a new line. So each space or segment is a new line, regardless of the sentence is done. Okay. And the rhyming scheme here seems to go back and forth, at least towards the beginning. Day, May, temperate, date. Not exactly a rhyme there. I guess it depends how you pronounce it. I could see what he was going for there, though. Shines, declines, so it seems to go in some kind of rhyming pattern. I'm going to look at what those patterns can be later on. Okay. Now, limerick, as we see up here in the top right, is very short. It has a rhythm to rhyme separate lines. So 1, 2, and 5 here rhyme, while lines 3 and 4 rhyme with each other, but not the other 3 lines. Also, syllables become a factor. A syllable is basically the beats that go into pronunciating a word or a phrase or a whole sentence, right? So market, I did 2 claps there. That meant it had 2 syllables because it took 2 different stops to pronounce the word market, while the word ran has 1. So let's look at the first line for the limerick example, and I'm going to count off the syllable count as I read. There once was a wonderful star. That's 8 syllables. As you can see, lines 1, 2, and 5, there are to be 8 to 9 syllables each. All right, so there's some flexibility. While lines 3 and 4, 5 to 6 syllables each. And the nature of the limerick is supposed to be mostly witty, a bit more comedic, but it can take various different tones. But that just is the tradition. An ode is a poem which a person expresses strong feelings. Right? You would think that that is almost an aspect of any poem, but an ode has a very specific focus on that. A classic ode is structured in 3 major parts, and we're not really going to look at those too extensively, but just things to keep in mind as you continue in poetry in your academic path. The next 2 are haiku and tanka, probably my 2 favorites. They're very short, but can say a lot in just a little bit of space. Right? Now, a haiku is 3 lines a 17-syllable poem, generally about nature. It doesn't have to be, but that seems to be the tradition, right? Now here's a haiku on the right side, and it counts off the syllables for each, right? So it goes in the pattern of 5-7-5, right? So frog jumps in still pond, right? So each word itself was only one syllable, and there's 5 words in the sentence, so it makes 5 syllables total, right? Now let's look at the second line. 7 syllables. Ripples the glassy surface, right? That's 7, and line 3 is 5, right? Again, mostly about nature, but you can form your own topics as well. Now the tanka, 5 lines, very similar to haiku. It just follows the same, the first 3 lines follow the exact same pattern, 5-7-5 syllables, right? But then really what it does is add 2 more lines that are 7 syllables each. Also generally about nature, but again, very emotive. So tankas are more of an ode than a haiku, but they don't have to be. A haiku can be quite emotional as well. Next are 2 longer forms of poetry. The narrative tells a story, while in the haiku, as you saw from examples, don't necessarily tell a story. They just use very descriptive words to create imagery in the mind of the audience and emotion as well. While narrative does focus on aspects of character, development, plot, serves more as a narration itself, hence the name narrative. An epic is very much a narrative, but very lengthy, and he uses very grand language. As you can see on the lower left-hand side is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a very famous example of epic poetry. It's one that you don't see as often anymore, but doesn't mean that there are not still writers writing in that form. The couplet, which is 2 lines of verse, which rhyme and as a unit alone. So the example we see, I think that I shall never see a poem as lovely as thee. So a poem may be composed of several couplets, and we'll see examples of that moving forward, both this week and next. And then the free verse. There's several different types of names for this, but we're going to refer to it as free verse, and that's just a poem that doesn't follow any of the rules. So as we see example Fog by Carl Sandburg, a very famous poet. The fog comes on little cat feet. It sits looking over harbor and city on silent haunches and then moves on. Really follows no traditional format. It looks like it's 2 lines and then separated by stanza into another stanza that creates 4. No real rhyme, no structure, but still doesn't mean that it can't be a poem. Important terms to keep in mind, one of which we're going to go over in more detail later on, but I want to introduce it here at least, that being meter. And that is basically determines or helps clue readers who are not the poet, or maybe if they were to read the poem themselves, maybe give them a sense of how the poem is meant to be said or pronounced when it comes to, as you can see in the little key on the right, we're going to look into some of those in the future, mostly I am and the long short, basically those kind of key in as to how certain things should be pronounced. So hickory dickory dock, the mouse ran up the clock. Now I'm not sure if I'm saying it right, but I'm taking a guess that these are meant to be pronounced at a certain type of pace. Is it supposed to be fast or slow? But if you just read it plainly, hickory dickory dock, the mouse ran up the clock, it still rhymes, but doesn't have the emotional impact that the author originally intended. And that's what meter helps us do, and that's by basically determining how words should be pronounced as they are said in a poem, which may be the same in regular speak or might be quite different. It all depends on the emotional impact. We'll look at more of that in a future lesson. And the rhyme, that's pretty straightforward. We're familiar with this. And it's mostly how the words sound. So even if the spelling is different, which it should be, because we're talking about 2 different words. But if you look at cloud and crowd, their sound is the same, or at least very similar. And not all rhymes need to be in couplets. So you see in the bottom 2, since it's color-coded, trees and breeze, that those 2 lines are couplets, but the rest of the poem is not. Right? So coding it that way just allowed us to visually track the rhyme. Look at 3 more elements. This more has to do with the structure. A refrain, which is something you see in songs pretty much all the time, though there are always exceptions, is a repeated line in a poem, very similar as you put here, the chorus of a song. In this case, if you look on the right, this is our key to identifying what each line of the poem is doing. The refrain is basically put in a capital C, and that is that line gets repeated. As you can see, it's he repeated here, because I'm on a holiday, and the next 3 stanzas. Speaking of stanza, these are a group of lines that make up a single unit. Double space is what you see. Let's see, let me get my marker here. What you see here, this kind of indicates a space here, all right? And so every time that happens, a new stanza is started. In this case, I see 4. They don't have to be the same size. What basically makes a stanza stand out is those double spaces in between each one. Basically, they form somewhat similar to a paragraph in poetry, but different and mostly shorter. But there are, especially in epic poetry, very long stanzas. And then the rhyme scheme, we see that on the right-hand side, they use letters to identify what lines rhyme with what lines. As you can see, if the rhyme scheme ended up being longer, we could have gone on to other letters. From what I see here, it only goes up to as far as C. But if they added more lines and didn't rhyme with anything else and was a new one, that would be D, a new line. But the A's rhyme with A's and so on. And so it looks like it's forming a similar kind of rhyme pattern, or pretty much it is the same rhyme pattern throughout. And we'll look at what that signifies also, because this is a very specific type of poem format we'll be looking at as well. For this unit, we'll also be looking at literary devices. There are many, but this is definitely not all that exist. But these are the ones we'll be looking at for this unit. These are the most common. And these are each types of techniques that not just poets, but storytellers or just anybody uses to express an idea and give more emotional emphasis to it. Such as the case of simile. A simile and metaphor both compare two unalike things to make a point. The only difference is a simile uses the word like or as, such as she's tough as nails. So the woman in the subject, indicated by the pronoun she, is being compared to nails. Two very different things, but it's meant to create an emotional and creative visual in our minds when it comes to thinking about this person that this line is about. Right? And so we'll be looking at these over the next few weeks for this unit as well, and incorporating them in our own work and seeing how other artists and poets have used it in their own. As we move through this unit, we'll be analyzing several different examples of poems. The process called explication, which is the analyzing of a literary work, doesn't necessarily have to be poetry, but in the case of this unit, that's what we'll be looking at. I've developed 8 different types of elements we'll be looking for when we examine and explicate other poems. It can be abbreviated as flat cats. It can be done in any order you want, just so long as you speak to each different part. We're going to start at the beginning with author. That is straightforward, who wrote the piece. Context is extremely crucial because that requires research, and that research might reveal something that was going on in the poet's life that might have inspired the writing of the poem, the tone of the poem, such if it's sad, maybe they're going through a breakup or a divorce at the time. If it's happy, maybe it's the opposite, they just met a love in their life and that inspired them to write a poem about it. Knowing those elements does add an extra level of understanding as to the theme and the author's message as we move forward and examine poems on deeper levels. The form, we looked at a few of those. The sonnets being one of them, the haiku, the tanka. We didn't go over hymn, which I might include in the next lesson next week. I'm just seeing what we have time for and the type of form that lesson is going to take from this point moving forward. Okay? The structure, number of lines, how many stanzas, the meter, which I said, like I said again, we'll go over in more detail next time. What's the rhyme scheme? Is it going in an A, B, A type format? Is it going in couplets, A, B, B, so forth? The tone, what's the attitude? Is it grumpy? Is it jubilant? Is it confused, meaning the poem's not confusing, but you get the sense that it's meant to portray a narrator who is feeling confused. Some of that, gain a deeper understanding of tone, will be revealed sometimes by the context, which is why context is so important. Literary devices, the way language is used, like I said, I briefly just had those listed on that PowerPoint slide prior to this. We'll be going into more detail what those are each later, but those are what we're going to be looking at when we consider literary devices. Theme, that's how what you feel is the message or the moral of the poem. Very similar to a story, right? It's what you personally interpret. What does it communicate to you? And so everybody will have a different idea of theme, just as long as you're able to reference why you think that, or what the poem does to make you think that. And then author's message, which is also a question of theme, but now it's less about your personal connection and more about what you think the author is trying to communicate. Maybe those match up, but they don't have to. The author could have meant one thing through their message and what they wanted you to feel, and you can still feel, interpret your own thing. So a theme is your personal approach or your personal interpretation of the message, and the author's message is what you think the author is actually trying to do, regardless if it worked. And that's the lesson for this week. I'm glad to see most of you are turning in work and participating. I was glad that you could join myself and the Kitty Page as she popped in every now and then. She is now resting and sleeping on my hand as I have to fortunately pull it away to stop the PowerPoints from recording. If you have any questions, again, I will be answering emails all week, but I'll be answering them live from 10 to 12 on Mondays and Thursdays. Be sure to read through all the directions and what's expected for this week. Continue to be safe, stay healthy, and I will look forward to composing your next lesson next week.